panelist is Dr. Denham, who is visiting us from Australian National University in Canberra. Tim studied at Cambridge, Penn State, at ANU, and he describes himself as a geoarchaeologist. This is somebody who uses the earth sciences to analyze and interpret archaeological findings, archaeological data and remains. Tim has done pioneering work on the emergence of domestication and cultivation of plants and animals in Asia and Pacific and beyond. And for me personally, one of the favorite things he's done is really started investigation of an amazing site in the highlands of Guinea called Cook Swamp, which has yielded truly surprising results. So please welcome Tim Denham.
This is a map showing the continent of Sahel with the variable sea levels at the time of Neolithic colonization. Hold on, I'm going to get this sorted out in a minute. Right, okay. And the thing is, I put this up because some of the maps that you see with much more extensive continental shelves, those shelves were exposed much later, okay? So I want you to bear this map in mind at all times, not the much more extensive ones. And also, Carl stole my line. My line was already in my talk. But the point I'm interested in really is what happened next. So people came from Ireland, Southeast Asia, or what is today Ireland, Southeast Asia, and they colonized Sahel, which is that landmass comprising New Guinea, Australia, and Tasmania. Now, there is a question actually about how people moved and migrated towards Australia. Now, part of that is to do with, did people come through the tropical rainforests of Ireland, Southeast Asia to colonize Sahel, or did they follow savanna corridors to do so? Now, I'm not really going to delve into that argument too much. All I want to know is, and get you to think about, are some things about adaptive strategies. Because when people came from Ireland, Southeast Asia, they came to Sahel, which has got very diverse climo-biogeographical regions in it. So in New Guinea and those sorts of areas, you have tropical rainforests, lowland montane rainforests. Then you have sort of monsoonal sort of savannas. You have deserts. You have even glacial areas. Okay, so you have a very diverse type of environment people then had to adapt to. Now, how did they do that? They're coming from tropical rainforest environments or savanna environments, but take your pick. How did they do that? Well, Jim talked a little bit about people burned. They burned the landscape in order to try and, create a landscape which was more amenable to them living in it as a means of sort of resource intensification. But also they engaged in broad spectrum animal exploitation and broad spectrum plant exploitation. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I always get the sense that a lot of people talk about people hunting or scavenging or fishing or gathering shellfish. But in tropical rainforests, probably the way you get most of your protein is from, okay, you get the occasional hunt and the occasional bit of game. But people eat a lot of grubs. They eat a lot of insects. They eat a lot of small things that you gather. So, you can cut down trees, leave them there, come back, a few months later, and you'll have kilos of grubs under the bark or in the pit if it's a palm. That is a great protein source. Now, people forget about all those things. People forget about hunting and running and doing all that stuff. That's just sort of a low-scale thing that has a big payoff, okay? And in terms of plant exploitation, okay, you all need caloric sources, so we all need calories, we all need energy to go out and give talks like this and stand here sweating, and you guys need it to try and stay awake in a very hot room. But the point is, you also need things which provide sources of protein, sources of oil, you need a range of vitamins. So it's broad-scale plant exploitation. Let's forget about just focusing on a few types of species, a few types of plants. I'd also like to continue a point that Jim made about maritime colonization, because he talked about maritime colonization through Wallacea. And he was talking about all those different sea crossings you had to make. But what's interesting is, people then, not only did they cross all those islands to get to Australia, or Sahel, But then they colonized islands in the Bismarck archipelago off to the northeastern coast of New Guinea. And so they colonized some around 40,000 years ago, and then other ones around 26, maybe the Solomon Islands, and then Manus was colonized over 20,000 years ago, and that required a sea crossing of over 200 kilometers. So that's a big crossing. That's not even a line of sight sea crossing, okay? And then the other question I think people need to talk about and think about is mobility. Well, I'm taking arms. And it's not just mobility in the way people diffuse or disperse. It's also mobility in terms of how they then operate within rough territories and how they utilize resources. So they move around. It's not like they're sitting around in one spot, but they're not moving around and migrating constantly. They're just moving around within prescribed territories. Even, you can imagine this even for hunting gathering groups that ethnographically, they all have sort of different territories and things like that. So they're some of the points we need to think about. And I did promise you visuals, so we'll go visual now. All right, the other thing I wanted to talk about, and again echoing Jim's point, is mega lakes. In the middle of Australia, there used to be lots of big lakes. And a lot of these dried out over the last 100,000 years. Now some of them were much more extensive when people got there, probably around 50, 45,000 years. And some of them then, dried out around that time, and other ones dried out much later. But the point is that the interior of Australia has more moisture in it than it does today, okay? So also, when you're thinking of Australia, I know a lot of people always think of arid deserts, but it wasn't always just about that. And here's a diagram showing about the Lake Lake Frome, Mega Lake Frome, and then some of the other things. The one on the right is looking at changing lake levels through time, and you can see that after around 70,000 years ago to the phase 3, it drops down considerably, okay? So you can use this to sort of justify the fact that I'm not making it up. Now, I can't really feel like an archaeologist unless I show a stone tool, but I've now done that, so we can move on. Now, the thing is, also in New Guinea, I thought I'd introduce you a little bit to some of the things about New Guinean archaeology. So, there's these beautiful objects, which are these mortar pestle figurine complex, which some of you who know museums or follow antiquities would know that these are very sort of special, beautiful objects. But archaeologically, we don't really know when they were made. We know they date to between around 7,000 to 3,000 years ago. We don't know what they were used for. We don't really know what they're associated with. So it's a very enigmatic complex. So I thought I'd put that up there because they are pretty, aren't they? Don't you think? Yeah, very pretty. And then I thought I'd also put up something about the Peter pottery, which dates to around 3,500 to 3,000 years ago. It's only been found on one side, there we go. Only one side on the island of New Guinea, but it's primarily in the Bismarck archipelago off the northeast coast. So those islands of New Britain, New Ireland, Manus. And it's also up here as a point of departure, because even though it dates to only 3,000 years ago, it's something that Terry Hunt tomorrow will be talking about in terms of colonization of the Pacific, okay? But I just thought I'd put that as a bookmark because it actually links to the region I'm talking about. So I'm just trying to mercilessly and unabashedly impose on this talk and take nice graphics out of it. But the big thing about New Guinea is also linguistic diversity. So New Guinea, even the eastern half of the island, which is the independent state of Papua New Guinea, has over 750 different languages. The whole island has 900, or over 900 languages. So it's a massive centre of global linguistic diversity, or one of the centres of global linguistic diversity. Now this map doesn't even show languages. This is showing language families, okay? So these are language families. So that's showing different, like, Indo-European is a language family, yeah? Or Austronesian is a language family. So these are language families which are comprised, if you like, of unrelated languages. So I thought I'd put that up because it is one of the enigmatic things about New Guinea that you have so much diversity. Now, how did we get here? All right, so that was just an introduction to some bookmarks. So I'm actually going to tell you a story which goes in reverse chronological order. Because what interests me really about colonization of Australia, New Guinea and places like that is how people adapted to the environment, how they use plants. I'm interested in plants, how people use plants, okay? So, what I want you to think about is sometimes my view of the world is that differences of emphasis. So people in Ireland, Southeast Asia, New Guinea, Australia, you know, go back 45,000 years ago, they're in these landscapes doing their thing. They probably had a common set of orientations to the world, they probably had a very similar set of technologies, practices, or practical experience, but then suddenly they started to diverge and do lots and lots of different things. And I'm going to tell you a story about one thing. And my starting point is going to be, strangely enough, March the 8th, 1933. So you'd be thinking to me yourself, look, we're talking about human origins, why has this guy gone to March the 8th, 1933? Well, that's the day when people first flew over the Wadi Valley in the highlands of New Guinea, okay? Until that point, the highlands were thought to have been deserted, no one was meant to live there in the mountains. But when they flew over it, they found over 1 million people in the Wadi Valley and neighbouring big intermontane valley systems, over 1 million people living there, densely populated, cultivating horticultural systems very intensively in a grassland landscape. And that started people asking a question, much as this conference is trying to ask a question, about when did people start living there and what were they doing? How did they get by? And in the New Guinea Highlands, the question is, how old is agriculture? Well, and before we start on that journey, I want you to think about it. Early agriculture and a lot of plant orientation in Ireland, Southeast Asia and New Guinea and parts of Australia looks at vegetative aspects of plant propagation. And it's not just vegetative aspects in terms of root crops, so like potatoes, what we'd be familiar with, or sweet potato, but there it's taro and yams, but also in terms of herbs, bananas, grasses, sugarcane, trees, are all vegetatively propagated, and also people engage in vegetative transplantation of palms and trees. So whether those trees are breadfruit or sago, people don't plant from seed. They wait for the seedlings to germinate and then they go and dig them up and move them. So that's sort of different, isn't it, from what we often do. And also, when you're thinking about early agriculture, you've got to think about mixed plot cultivation and something else, polyculture. Right. So, this is someone preparing some sugarcane stalks or stems to be cut up and planted, and there's someone planting a banana sucker. Both of those plants, the initial stages of the domestication of those two plants, very globally important economically species today, both the domestication started in the New Guinea region of those plants. So we're not talking about a backward area. But what we are talking about is that the archaeological investigations into early agriculture started very quickly in the decades after people first went into the highlands. And this is Warrawal Plantation in the Wadi Valley, and these are some of these excavation trenches that were opened up. These particular ones aren't from the original excavations in 1964 there, but they're from the 77 re-excavation. And this is the highland spine of New Guinea. And this is showing the variability in major staple groups across New Guinea today, and this is it in the past. And the reason I'm showing this too is that to emphasize to you, people in different places are exploiting different things. When we think about people in a place like New Guinea, a lot of people think, oh yeah, those people do this. They don't. Those people there are doing lots and lots of different things. And if you want to get a handle on those different things, you can't take bits and pieces from all over the place and put them together to try and infer what people were doing. You have to build up a very strong regional record to do so. Okay. So, how did people live in tropical rainforests? Well, people think, rainforests are quite difficult environments to live in some ways, but not in others. People tend to focus on things like gaps and patches. This is where people, a gap or, a tree fall sort of gap opens up in the rainforest. Those areas not only become important in terms of allowing a lot of pioneer plant species like yams and bananas to start growing there naturally, but also, you bring in different sorts of fauna as well, both medium-sized sort of fauna that might come in to browse and things, and also in terms of grubs and things like that in the fallen vegetation. There's also talk in the New Guinean archaeological record of there being Pleistocene age house sites. But I actually think that's a red herring, and I don't believe either of those sites. But I thought I'd put it in there because it's quite a nice picture of a house site, isn't it, really? And it's also got a banana plant next to it, you see, so that's like extra value. But when people are actually beginning to cultivate, I think we need to think about how people what does it look like? If I asked everyone in this room to shut their eyes and think, what does early agriculture look like? We'd all have a different opinion. Well, actually, no, don't shut your eyes, because you'll never come back. But if you were to shut your eyes, everyone in this room would have a different idea of what we envisage. Yeah? But if you think about in a place like New Guinea, here we've got a shifting cultivation plot in the rainforest. Now, obviously, shifting cultivation only started around 10,000 years ago to 7,000 years ago in the New Guinea highlands. But people start planting, intercropping things. It doesn't probably look what you would imagine it to be like, But by 7,000 to 6,500 years ago, people started mound cultivation on the wetland margin. We know that there's these mounds that are preserved archaeologically with very high frequencies of banana fibrillus, which show that people were almost certainly cultivating bananas at this time. We also know at that time that the forest signal for this region is gone, because as people more intensively use the environment, the fallow system breaks down and grasslands replace the forest. And in this part of the Wagi Valley, the intermontane rainforests were cleared from the valley floor around 7,000 years ago, and they did not come back. And you can see here, it also dates to when we start to get, there's a second stone tool. There were these fully ground sort of axes turn up around 6,500 to 7,000 years ago as well in this area. And of course, they would have greatly assisted in cutting down trees. And here we have, from 4,500 years ago onwards, we have, these are a whole different series of drain ditch networks on the edge of the Cook Swamp site. The long linear one going back in the foreground to background is about 3,000 years old, okay? So that's an old ditch overlain by later ditch systems, some of which may be 1,000 years, some 800, some 400 years. So this wetland margin was drained periodically with different field systems. And here we have a picture, an ethnographic picture from the Baleen Valley in West Papua today, which is part of Indonesia. You can see a boy using a wooden digging implement. And here we have on the right-hand side a wooden digging implement from an archaeological context in the highlands of New Guinea. They look almost identical, would you not think? But the one on the right is over 4,000 years old, okay? So it's the oldest wooden digging implement found in New Guinea that's used in an agricultural setting. And these are pictures from when the first Europeans went into the Upper Wagi Valley. And Cook Swamp, you see that ridge in the top left picture? Cook Swamp is on the other side of that ridge. So this is just in the vicinity, but you can see how this landscape is denuded of forest. Yeah? So, my question is, no, actually, it's probably the question you're asking yourselves, which is, why is this guy talking about agriculture? Well, I'm talking about it because, for me, if we want to understand how people adapted to the diverse landscapes of Sahel, we need to build up really good regional records. And at the moment, in terms of understanding how people use plants in the Pleistocene, we only have very scant records. Those scant records seem to suggest that up until probably the beginning of the Holocene, people were doing similar types of things in Ireland, Southeast Asia, New Guinea and Australia. The types of plants they were exploiting, even though the species differed, the strategies were sort of comparable. Yeah, they used a bit of these roots, dug up roots, used a variety of different sources of plants in the landscape. But then something started to change. And in New Guinea we end up with agriculture from maybe 7,000 or earlier years ago, whereas, say, in Australia, people are still considered to permanently have remained as hunter and gatherers. So, maybe that's true. But this diagram is up here because what I want people to think about though is, okay, we can reconstruct bits and pieces of how people exploit resources. But this diagram is trying to show that in this world of island Southeast Asia and Guinea, this vegetative orientation to the world actually also has a social correlate as well. People who engage in that sort of vegetative transplanting of things, they transpose that mode of thinking onto their own society. Okay? So we need to not only begin thinking about the material elements of the deep past, we also need to start to think about what that might mean for the entangled social components of that deep past as well. And this diagram here, which you probably can't read, and I wish I had a pointer on this thing, but I don't think I do. Oh yes, I do. Here it is. No, you don't. It's up there, isn't it? Can you see it? But it won't come down now. So, but the idea here is to show, which you can't really see, but very similar types of species were being exploited, say, in Borneo and New Guinea during the Pleistocene. So there's not much difference there. But the types of plants and the orientation to the landscape and the plants in it suggest that in both locations people had this shared vegetative orientation to the world from a long time ago. And then seeds grow in the form of rice only come in, say in Borneo, in scant form from about 4,000 years ago. So this vegetative orientation is a very deep temporal duration in this world. But what of Australia? Well, unfortunately, you would probably say that you have similar sorts of things in terms of tuber and seed processing beginning around 30 to 40,000 years ago, and until about 20,000, well actually no, until after 10,000 years ago, until the Holocene, again, you're still seeing very generalised types of behaviour. But in Australia also, as you go through the Holocene, you end up with these more regional traditions begin emerging of plant exploitation. So people began to do things in diverse ways. And what we see is in New Guinea, maybe that sort of divergence led to agriculture in some places, not everywhere in New Guinea though. Even when Europeans first went there, not everyone was a cultivator, there were still hunting and gathering groups there. So it's not like agriculture, once it kicks off, dominates, takes over fully, even though I know we often think that. Also, this similar regional divergence was happening in the Holocene in Australia. And so that's where I want to leave it. I just want you to think about the fact that Jim O'Connell, presented you with a lot of ideas, a lot of data about how people colonised Sahel. And I want you to begin to think about, well, what happened next? How did it suddenly change to follow such diverse trajectories? Okay? So that's where I'm going to leave it. Thanks a lot.